precisely what happened that night.
Saw the man hit me.
It was a pack of lies. This enormous story just got 10 times bigger again.
Hi, glad to see you back on my channel. What do you think about when you think of crazy love? Perhaps two young people madly in love with each other? Or perhaps obsessed with each other, willing to go to any lengths to secure each other's love? Yup, crazy love can become truly toxic, especially when both partners behave obsessively towards one another. This is the second part of the case of Tracy Andrews and her fiancé, Lee Harvey. It's about to get even more dangerous than the first part, but if you're ready for it, let's dive in. It was December 1996, and Alva Church was flooded with journalists and TV reporters trying to get to the bottom of a horrific road rage incident.
From the very first moment, it was clear that this was going to be a huge story, an absolutely huge story. Just the idea of a road rage murder made it already a big story. And as the first morning progressed, everything we discovered made it a bigger story.
Two men had forced 27-year-old Tracy Andrews and her 25-year-old fiancé, Lee Harvey, to stop their car. Then the passenger got out and Lee to death, also punching Tracy before going back to the car. Meanwhile, the police were looking for a dark-colored Ford Sierra, as Tracy had given them this description of the attacker's vehicle. It was the only lead that they had at the time.
And obviously we started a vehicle inquiry with the DVLA for the owner details of any vehicle that might fit that description.
The police thought it was a bit strange that initially Tracy couldn't remember any details about the car, but a few days later she suddenly could. However, it is normal for victims to be in shock after such a horrible incident. Tracy had just watched her fiancé give his last breath in a pool of... No one expected her to be at her best, which is why Tracy made the headlines throughout the UK just a couple of days after the murder. The police decided to make a public appeal, a standard technique in a murder investigation, as it encourages people from all around the area to empathize with the victims and come forth with any relevant information that might help the police catch the killer. On December 3rd, Tracy joined everyone else in the press conference. Superintendent Ian Johnson, who was leading the investigation, met with Tracy just before the conference.
I met Tracy somewhere around about 10 a.m., I believe, just before we were going to do the press conference. I asked her if she was content to do the press conference, if it was something that she wanted to do. She said that she was. She said she really wanted to do it.
Needless to say, Tracy's presence at the public appeal sparked the interest of all journalists in the area. It could get very dramatic.
This hugely hiked up the media interest because we were going to have put in front of us, it was said, the key witness and someone, we'd all seen the pictures by this time, an attractive blonde, and she was going to sit there in front of us and answer our questions. There was massive media interest in this.
But if the media were hoping for an attractive woman to get into the public eye, Tracy was a bit of a letdown compared to her model photos that made it to the newspapers. She had red eyes, injuries all over her face, and was sitting in a crouched up position, mouth open, looking extremely tired.
And Tracy did look like a victim. She had the injuries to her face. She looked incredibly distressed, incredibly upset.
Within minutes, the detective became a side story, and Tracy was the center of all reporters' questions. But this didn't seem to bother Tracy, as you probably know by now. She enjoyed the attention.
It was about the story, it was about the situation, and the press were interested in Tracy, and she was quite happy to deal with the press.
Both me and the other person were like playing cat and mouse with each other for a while. And they overtook us. I was shouting at
Tracy appeared very upset with the whole situation and angry at the killer throughout her lengthy answers to the press. One particular moment stood out.
When talking about the alleged killer, there was a moment when suddenly her eyes came up and she was mostly downcast throughout the press conference, but her eyes came up, and they flashed fiercely, and her mouth dropped open a bit with that famous, slightly jutting draw, and she looked really angry.
This became the picture used in most newspapers and TV reports at the time. The picture of the victim, angry and determined to find her lover's awful killer. People felt for Tracy. Who could ever want to be in such a dreadful situation?
It's just the way he looked. His eyes he had starey eyes. It just didn't seem normal. I saw the man hit me. I don't know what with. I didn't see anything.
Then, Tracy did something quite strange. She began appealing to the driver, telling him he's not in any trouble, as he wasn't the one who committed the murder.
Whoever this person is that was with you, you obviously know him. But he's ruined my life. Please, just tell us who he is, because you won't get in any trouble at all. It was not your fault.
But that statement did not sit well with the superintendent.
And I'm thinking, well, that's not strictly true, is it? You've driven your friend to a murder scene, he's killed someone, and you've driven him away, so you are in trouble.
What was Tracy getting at? She wasn't really in any position to decide who was in trouble and who isn't. She wasn't with the police after all. Had she gotten excited by all the spotlight, or was she playing at something darker? The press conference was a long one, and soon enough, Tracy became sloppy. She started giving contradicting statements about the event's timeline. When the reporter pointed this out to her, Tracy looked at him in her strange, open-mouthed way and insisted it was 10 to 10 she'd left the pub. This is not what she'd told the police.
And sat on her left was Superintendent Johnston. And I just saw him react to that answer from Tracy. And very slowly, his head turned to the right. And he just looked at her in a kind of assessing way.
People watching the conference on TV might have been brought to tears by Tracy's sadness and anger, just empathizing with her horror story. But by the time the press conference finished, reporters had gathered outside, and some were already thinking she'd done it. She had killed Lee, and invented a whole tearjerker story to distract the police and the public alike.
This enormous story just got 10 times bigger again if she is the killer.
Tracy had given an emotional statement about her fiancé's murder, but her lies were wearing thin as the police were uncovering gruesome clue after gruesome clue. Meanwhile, Tracy and Lee's families were in shambles, but Tracy didn't care for standing by their side.
It's self-preservation. That's what's driving her behaviour at this point in time. She's got absolutely no empathy whatsoever for Lee or for Lee's family, or indeed for her own family, who are also going to be really badly affected by this. So she's thinking, how do I best preserve myself? I'm going to take that role of the victim and I'm going to put myself in it.
As the police went door to door getting statements from any potential witnesses, a young girl who lived close to the crime scene described hearing a heated argument on the night of December 1st. But unlike Tracy had described the event, it wasn't two men fighting.
But she could clearly hear a row going on. What she remembered was that one was a distinctly male baritone voice. The other voice was much softer. And she said it was much more like a woman's voice.
The forensics team also went to the crime scene, explaining it inch by inch and digging for clues. They found the spring and other tiny parts from a pocket knife. They were slowly unraveling the mystery behind the murder weapon. But just like Superintendent Johnson had noticed on the very night of the murder, there were zero signs of a car overtaking another one. Something, if not everything, from Tracy's story was off. The police found a black beanie hat around the spot where Lee's car had been stopped.
Her assumption was, well, this has maybe fallen out of the assailant's pocket and he's not realised it. So, of course, that went to the laboratory fairly quickly with a view towards DNA and from hair samples, that sort of thing. And We had the report back by the Wednesday that this was animal hair and it was cat hair.
Tracy had a black and white cat, and the police knew this by now. They proceeded to visit Tracy and get a sample of hair from her cat. Unsurprisingly, it was the cat's hair on the beanie hat. This was Lee's hat, and Tracy had kept it in her coat pocket for a while, prior to the murder. Then why did she say it belonged to the attacker? If she had told the truth, that wouldn't have looked suspicious at all. Now the police were only piling more and more of her inconsistent stories. And along with the weird stories, the forensic team found something even more troubling.
In Lee's hand, they found between 80 and 100 strands of Tracy's hair that have been pulled from Tracy's head as Lee has tried to defend himself. Now, if Lee had been murdered by this fat man with staring eyes, why would he have Tracy's hair in his hand?
Indeed, this was a huge chunk of hair. No one pulls 100 strands easily from someone's head. Lee must have been desperate for his life. But when Ian Johnson asked Tracy about this, she said that Lee did this as he was dying. He simply wasn't in control of his actions anymore. However, as you'd probably guessed for a long time now, nothing of what Tracy was saying was true. On the late evening of December 1st, Tracy went into a fit of rage, had Lee pull over, and then stabbed him 42 times with her pocket knife. Her jealousy and possessiveness had turned into hate, and that night, she couldn't control it anymore.
She wasn't thinking to herself as she set off from the pub that evening, oh, tonight's the night I think I'm going to kill Lee. She just exploded like a volcano. Over a matter of minutes, literally, she went from mildly angry to obsessively angry.
However, this doesn't make her act less premeditated. It was her decision only, and no outside factors contributed to Lee's death.
When we talk about premeditated murder, we tend to assume that it's something that's days, weeks, or months in the planning, but actually premeditation only needs to take seconds. You only need to have a few seconds to decide that you are going to end somebody's life, and she made that decision on this evening.
On December 4th, a day after the press conference, the police received some even more troubling news. Tracy tried to take her own life.
Tracy takes an overdose, and I think this is a very deliberate, a very determined act on her part. I think she was absolutely set on ending her own life, because over the past few days, the situation has spiraled completely out of her control.
Tracy realized she could no longer keep her victim's story straight. There were more and more holes, and the police were about to get to the bottom of the truth behind the night of December 1st. The attempt was one last attempt to gain control of the situation again. But her awful plan failed. And on the same day, 2 witnesses called the police about seeing Lee's white Ford Escort on the night of the murder.
Who said, we've seen it in the local paper. I know I've seen this white car. We were driving from Alfchurch in the opposite direction.
The witnesses had also driven to Bromsgrove that evening, and they could clearly see that there was no one following Lee and Tracy that evening. It was a mere 10-minute drive, and if that had happened, the witnesses would have noticed it. This was a defining moment for the investigation. Now, the police had clear proof that there was no road rage incident. Plus, Tracy had just tried to exit this whole horror show by taking her own life. The police tactics changed dramatically.
And realistically, without a following vehicle, without a dark-coloured Ford Sierra chasing that car, then the whole being of that explanation from Tracy just didn't stand up.
On Saturday, December 7th, Tracy was arrested in the hospital. Imagine the impact this had on all the people that had seen her weep for her fiancé on TV just a few days before. And of course, the impact on Lee's family, who had wanted Tracy out of Lee's life for a long time. Meanwhile, the forensics team went over to her house and collected the clothes she'd worn on the night of the murder.
The forensic scientist, who had examined one of Tracy's zip-up boots, she had a pair of ankle boots on, and within that he'd found a mark in the leather which had a rounded top on it and seemed to bear all the impression of the outside shape of the knife.
The police concluded that most likely, Tracy hid the knife inside her boot after the murder and disposed of it at the hospital that night.
She could have easily just like thrown the knife into the grass or into the forest, whatever it was, and hope the police wouldn't find. But she even thought, no, these guys are gonna bring dogs. They're gonna, search the whole area. They will probably find something.
Tracy was charged with first-degree murder of Lee Harvey. Her trial was set for July 1997. But Tracy was set on sticking to her story. She was an innocent victim of a road rage incident. Once again, Tracy was the face of every newspaper and TV report. The Birmingham court was flooded with cameras and excited reporters. Prosecutor David Krigman was confident he had a strong case against Tracy. The best evidence was the witness's statement and, of course, her boots and bloody sweater.
She was covered in which she claimed had come onto her clothing when she was comforting him as he died, as she held him in the road. But a lot of this was sprayed. It was arterial that had come out of the carotid in a fountain and sprayed like a waterfall.
Yeah, you wouldn't get that from comforting someone.
Carotid artery is very close to the surface, so if it's breached, it will spray under pressure from the heart out of that wound, out into the air, and it will land on things next to it.
But people at the trial genuinely feared that Tracy could convince the judge of her innocence. After all, she'd done it before, in front of just as many cameras.
There was genuine apprehension in the prosecution camp that a jury may be persuaded by not only the story, but the skill, I would say, the skill with which she was able to advance what she had to say.
Tracy pleaded not guilty, but the prosecution began by painting a picture of her character, her jealousy and possessiveness of Lee, the heated arguments, the rifts she created between Lee and his sister. Then there was all the evidence, Tracy's boots, the sweater, and so on. Then it was Tracy's turn to sit in the witness box and answer the prosecution's questions. Tracy's cross-examination lasted 3 whole days.
And in that time, the highly intellectual David Krigman just took her story apart. He just deconstructed it around her. She was left there effectively naked in the middle of her story, in shreds on the floor.
By exposing Tracy's many lies and story inconsistencies, the prosecutor was able to show that she was lying about the whole story.
It was only within the finest of detail, as one mounted on top of the next, that you began to see the story was a pack of lies.
By the last day, Tracy's only answers to David were, "I don't know," and "I don't remember." Her credibility was reduced to ashes. While the jury gathered to reach a decision, Tracy agreed to give an interview to journalist Rod Chater inside the court next to her lawyers.
It was absolutely bizarre. Never, in 35 years on Fleet Street, never did it before, never did it again, interview the accused while the jury's out. Extraordinary.
Tracy thought that if she couldn't convince the judge of her innocence, she might convince Rod. She gave him a tearjerker account of how she was an innocent victim and how she would love Lee until the day she died. 20 minutes later, just as Rod was trying to ask her more daring questions, the speakers called everyone into the courtroom, and the jury had reached a verdict. Tracy was found guilty.
Despite the strain that Tracy Andrews must have felt during 4 weeks in the dock, she didn't even flinch as the jury foreman told her that she was guilty. Even though she kept her head bowed, her face remained impassive, even as the judge said to her, "Only you know precisely what happened that night."
Tracy just shook her head once, as a way of saying she didn't agree with the jury's decision. She was sentenced to life in prison with a possibility of parole after 14 years. As the guards took Tracy past her family, she broke down in tears. Tracy was away, but her and Lee's families were forever ridden with the question, why?
Well, when we asked the question, why do we think Tracy Andrews Lee Harvey, it was because she felt that Lee was hers. He was her possession. This wasn't a relationship that was about love. It was a relationship that was about control and ownership. And in ending somebody's life, you are completely possessing them. And that was what was going on that evening when she chose to take Lee's life.
In April 1999, over 2 years after the murder, Tracy admitted to stabbing Lee in a letter to her lawyer. However, she argued it was entirely in self-defense.
Now, how she could maintain that, given that he had wounds in his back and he was bigger than she was, I find that very difficult to believe, but nevertheless, that's what she insisted.
In July 2011, Tracy was freed from prison. Apparently, she had been a model prisoner and was given parole after 14 years. But that's not what one of the prison mates said. She was a former prison lover of Tracy's, and according to her, Tracy was still very jealous and possessive of her lovers. Once, she her after seeing her talk to one of her ex-girlfriends. Somehow she'd made parole. Tracy then changed her name to Tia Carter and had £5 million worth of plastic surgery, changing her jawline. A few years later, she changed her name again to Jenna Stevens. In 2017, Tracy married a bouncer named Phil Goldsworthy in Cornwall. The two had met while working at a local pub. Phil is 10 years her senior and has 4 kids from a previous marriage. In fact, his ex-wife accused Tracy of breaking their marriage. Apparently, Phil became fascinated with Tracy's history and was just as eager to start a relationship with her as she was. Tracy has also become a grandmother after her daughter Carla had a baby. Perhaps the lack of news in the last few years is good, but not everyone believes Tracy or Jenna is fully a rehabilitated convict.
This is a woman of cunning, of deceit, and with a vicious temper.
Throughout her relationship with Lee, Tracy was aggressive, unforgiving, and extremely possessive. The murder wasn't her first instance of violence, and her lover 42 times is truly a disturbing act that is not easily erased.
When you stab somebody 42 times, you are deciding to continue doing this. Your arm is going to be tired. There are going to be opportunities for you to stop, and you decide to keep going.
Crime of passion is the wrong term for what Tracy did to her fiancé. She was in control and filled with hate, not love. No one should go through such a relationship, and it's a very sad thought that Lee didn't get out of it in time, even after his family's many pieces of advice. Thanks for watching, you guys. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more blood-chilling true crime. See you next time, and stay safe.